Surface-level tranquility. In the serene suburbs of Connecticut, the Harper family resided in a charming two-story home, complete with a white picket fence and a neatly trimmed front yard. To neighbors and friends, Allison and Mark Harper were the very definition of a successful American couple. Allison, with her warm smile and thoughtful blue eyes, worked as a middle school counselor, a beloved figure among parents and students alike. Mark, well-dressed and articulate, was a regional sales manager for a major insurance firm, often seen attending community barbecues or coaching the local Little League team. Their weekends were a flurry of social events, brunches with neighbors, hikes in the nearby nature preserve, and Sunday dinners where laughter echoed through the open-air kitchen. Photographs that lined the walls and social media feeds portrayed a family steeped in happiness. Travel memories, school achievements, and holiday celebrations. Yet beneath the surface, tiny cracks began to form in the otherwise perfect facade. Their closest family friend, Hannah Mitchell, had become like a sister to Allison over the years. Since college days, their bond had never faded, and now, as a single paralegal living nearby, Hannah was often at the Harper house, helping with Allison's garden, sharing wine on Friday nights, or joining Mark and Allison for family movie marathons. To the outside world, the trio was inseparable, bound by years of shared history and the kind of easy trust forged in their 20s. But sometimes, Allison would notice faint moments of discomfort. A glance exchanged between Mark and Hannah that lingered a beat too long, the way Mark seemed to brighten at Hannah's jokes, or Hannah offering to help Mark with small, unnecessary chores around the house. Still, Allison waved away any uneasy feelings as overreactions. After all, she told herself, they were grown adults, and Hannah was practically family. Life marched on smoothly, or so it seemed. Mark's career thrived, earning him not only the admiration of his peers, but also a temptation to work late or travel frequently for business. Allison, ever the patient and supportive wife, tried not to mind, pouring her energy into community projects and her students. On many evenings, she found comfort in Hannah's companionship, grateful for her friend's presence during Mark's absences. The home, tastefully decorated in soft earth tones and filled with the scent of fresh-baked cookies, became the backdrop for their story, a snapshot of the American dream. Allison prided herself on keeping everything in order, from their meticulously balanced finances to annual anniversary trips. She wrote loving notes for Mark to find in his briefcase, and every Friday she and Hannah unwound together over takeout and classic movies. Nothing seemed amiss, or at least, nothing Allison allowed herself to see. For while outsiders looked on with envy at their picture-perfect life, and while Allison convinced herself she was truly happy, something unseen and silent was weaving its way into the very heart of her marriage. In the golden glow of suburban sunsets, the illusion of tranquility endured. Fragile, beautiful, and utterly unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing just beneath the surface, the onset of suspicion. As autumn settled over the quiet suburb, Allison's routine carried on with its usual rhythm, but a subtle undercurrent of disquiet began to unsettle her well-ordered life. Like a faint hum beneath a familiar melody, things once overlooked now drew her notice. The persistent flash of Mark's phone screen late at night, the way he would slip out of the room to take calls or respond to messages in curt, hushed tones. Technology, once a tool of connection, had become a silent wedge in their marriage. It started innocently enough, a missed dinner here, a vague explanation for a late night there. Mark's work always had periods of increased demands, and Allison had grown accustomed to dinners for one, their conversations too often interrupted by his buzzing phone. Yet, when he began to step out onto the back deck for calls, shutting the sliding door firmly behind him, she felt the first faint sting of isolation. Even Hannah, usually eager for their Friday night movies, had started to arrive late or text last-minute apologies, citing workload or family matters. Allison's unease grew quietly, swelling in moments no one else seemed to notice. She found herself replaying simple interactions, the quick glances between Mark and Hannah during game night, or the tone in Mark's voice when Hannah's name came up. It was nothing overt, just a flicker of something secretive, perhaps even collusion. Each small instance, on its own, seemed innocuous, but together they coalesced into a pattern she couldn't ignore. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Allison gathered laundry from the bedrooms, her mind drifting aimlessly until a whiff of cologne caught her attention on Mark's dress shirt. One he hadn't worn to their dinner date the night before. A sense of uncertainty bloomed in her chest, making her heartbeat skip. She brushed the suspicion away, reminding herself not to invent problems, but questions continued to fester. At work, Allison found herself distracted, often gazing out the window as worry preoccupied her thoughts. She recalled advice she'd given countless students about trust and communication, yet now found herself unable to voice her own fears to anyone. Was she becoming paranoid? Or was her intuition warning her of something more insidious? Each time she considered asking Hannah or confronting Mark directly, she hesitated, afraid of appearing jealous, irrational, or even losing the very people closest to her altogether. By mid-November, the emotional distance in her marriage had become more pronounced. Mark was home less often, not just physically, but emotionally detached when he was present. Conversation felt stilted, perfunctory. When Allison suggested a weekend getaway, Mark shrugged off the idea, citing end-of-year deadlines at work. Hannah seemed distracted as well, their lively banter replaced by polite, surface-level chatter. One evening, while preparing dinner, Allison's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You deserve the truth. Ask Mark about his late meetings." Her hands trembled as she read the message over and over. The text felt like a confirmation of her darkest fears, yet she was paralyzed, unsure whether to confront Mark immediately or to dig further on her own. Suddenly, the once invisible cracks in her perfect life were widening. Allison's heart wavered between loyalty and doubt, love and the painful urge for truth. Silent questions multiplied. Could she trust her own perceptions? Was she seeing patterns that didn't exist, or missing clues that were right in front of her? Every conversation, every late night, became charged with meaning. Haunted by suspicion, Allison spent sleepless nights wrestling with possibilities, torn between clinging to her faith in her marriage and facing what she feared most: betrayal from the two people she loved and trusted above all. The familiar warmth of her home, once a source of comfort, now felt shadowed by uncertainty. And as the first snow fell outside, Allison realized her life was shifting in ways she couldn't control. The subtle onset of suspicion quietly rewriting the future she thought she knew. The truth begins to emerge. For days, Allison's world felt as if it were spinning just slightly off its axis, everything familiar now tinged with doubt. Where she once saw comfort, she now noticed details she had never cared to examine before. Receipts left carelessly on the kitchen counter, barely perceptible shifts in schedules, and vague explanations that simply didn't add up. Each clue, however small, gathered weight in her mind, no longer lost among the noise of daily life. One chilly Thursday afternoon, driven by a gnawing sense of uncertainty, Allison found herself rifling through a stack of household bills. She'd always managed the finances, but anxiety urged her to revisit charges and statements. There, nestled between utility payments and grocery runs, were unexplained expenses. Dinners for two at upscale restaurants she'd never visited, motel transactions strangely timed with Mark's out-of-town meetings, and rideshare charges to addresses she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she organized the receipts into neat piles, the gravity of each one deepening her suspicion. That evening, Allison waited until Mark was preoccupied with work emails before quietly checking the family's home security cameras, installed for peace of mind, now repurposed as silent witnesses. She scrolled through archived footage of evenings when Mark was supposedly still at the office or away on business. To her dismay, short clips surfaced. Hannah's familiar car pulling up to the curb on odd, unannounced evenings, Mark and Hannah entering the house together, while Allison was known to be at a school event. Even quick hugs exchanged in the foyer when they believed themselves unobserved. Tormented by equal parts grief and resolve, Allison pressed further. With subtlety and care, she placed a discreet voice recorder in the living room, the heart of their home, where laughter and secrets mingled. On a night when she stayed late at a school fundraiser, Allison listened afterward to hushed conversations between Mark and Hannah. The tone low and intimate, the awkward silence punctuating comments about keeping things hidden, and Laura's name, her own, spoken with a hesitance that felt like a knife. As evidence accumulated, Allison's despair gave way to a cold clarity. She collected everything with meticulous precision. Screenshots of ambiguous text messages that hinted at secret meetings and longing, time-stamped images from security footage, and the voice files that filled in the devastating blanks. In stolen moments after midnight, she created a digital folder containing every trace of betrayal, or as she now named it, her truth file. Yet facing reality was a shock unlike anything Allison had ever known. Sitting at her dining table late one evening, the silent house pressed in on her. Here was the proof, undeniable and all-consuming, that the people she trusted most had conspired to dismantle the life she'd built. She wasn't simply facing infidelity. She was facing a double betrayal, marked by familiar footsteps and voices she'd always associated with comfort and safety. Conflicting emotions warred within her. A part of Allison longed to confront Mark and Hannah immediately, to scream and demand answers. But another part, colder and stronger, urged restraint. Anger would only grant them more power. There was justice to be found, but it would not come from impulsive outbursts or empty accusations. She needed a plan not only to protect herself, but to ensure that those who hurt her would answer for every lie and every calculated risk they took under her roof. By the end of that week, Allison's sorrow transformed into resolve. She stood before her bedroom mirror, staring at the reflection of someone forever changed. No longer merely a wife and friend, she was now the architect of her own retribution. Gathering her evidence, Allison knew with concise certainty the truth had finally surfaced and the days of pretending were over. All that remained was to decide how and when she would reveal everything. Silent evidence gathering. Allison moved through her days with a new kind of vigilance, each moment painted with a heightened sense of purpose she dared not show. The initial sting of betrayal, while still raw, was slowly morphing into something steely and resolute. She told herself, over and over, that if her world was going to combust, it would do so on her terms. There would be no wild accusations hurled in the heat of emotion, no messy drama that could be twisted or denied. She would gather the truth piece by piece, quietly and thoroughly, until there was no possible way for Mark or Hannah to wriggle free. She started with legal groundwork. Late at night in their guest bedroom, Allison dialed the number of a discreet local attorney. The law office had stellar reviews for managing contentious divorces with both compassion and quiet ferocity. Over the phone, she introduced herself only by her first name. Carefully, without revealing identifying details, she laid out a hypothetical scenario. Her husband cheating, her concern for protecting assets, her suspicion that emotional manipulation might emerge once the subject of divorce was broached. The lawyer's calm voice guided her. She learned about documenting assets, closing joint lines of credit in advance, and establishing a private bank account in her name alone. The lawyer assured her that in Connecticut, evidence of infidelity, even if not criminally punishable, could carry significant weight in court, particularly regarding asset division and reputation. Quietly scribbling notes, Allison began her own personal checklist for a war she'd never wanted. Her next step was to protect herself financially. She created an online account under her maiden name, shifting a modest amount of money each week, enough to build a safety net, but not so much as to invite suspicion. She inventoried household valuables, photographing jewelry, family heirlooms, and expensive electronics. Copying key documents, tax returns, insurance policies, retirement account statements, she uploaded each scan into an encrypted drive only she could access. Each task made her feel more in control, giving her a flickering sense of agency amidst the ache and humiliation. Allison then shifted focus to the evidence itself. While her earlier discoveries had been accidental, a receipt here, a suspicious text message there, she was now deliberately hunting for proof. She bought a slim digital voice recorder and placed it inconspicuously behind a stack of novels on the living room bookshelf. Every time Mark worked from home and Hannah happened to drop by, the device would quietly capture their conversations. On a few occasions, Allison pretended to leave the house for errands, circling the block and parking where she could see the driveway. Her heart pounded as she watched Hannah's car appear. Always at times, they assumed she would be gone for hours. Listening to the recordings late at night, Allison endured the agony of hearing Mark and Hannah trade inside jokes, share intimate whispers, and, more gut-wrenching still, declare that it would all be worth it soon. Never once did they mention Allison's name in a way that conveyed remorse. If anything, her absence seemed to embolden their affection. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was an audible, living thing, breathing between syllables and long silences. But Allison wanted more than implication. She purchased a small nanny cam, disguised as a clock, and set it up in the study, a room she rarely entered but Mark often used for video meetings. From the recordings, she captured images of Hannah brushing Mark's sleeve, their hands lingering over coffee mugs, even a stolen kiss, quick but unmistakable. She exported key frames to her secret hard drive, labeling everything with dates and times. Throughout this process, Allison cultivated an impeccable poker face. She bore the familiar roles of loving wife and loyal friend without so much as a falter. She organized family dinners, baked Mark's favorite lemon cakes, and scrolled through social media, posting cheerful updates. To Hannah, she remained warm and attentive, even offering advice about a work crisis that Hannah invented to justify her frequent absences. Behind every pleasant word and polite smile, Allison memorized patterns, which days they met, what lies they told, how their stories diverged and intersected. When Hannah texted apologies for canceling movie night, Allison responded with empathy. When Mark claimed he was working late, she sent supportive messages and set aside leftovers. The imbalance between her outer composure and inner turmoil wore on her, but Allison knew that to tip her hand now, even a little, would be disastrous. The moment either betrayed party grew suspicious, they would disappear into secrecy, denying everything and possibly erasing the evidence. She had to play the long game, no matter the emotional cost. She paid careful attention to small digital traces. Mark's changing phone passcode, Hannah's increased use of encrypted messaging apps, the sudden deletion of shared playlists and private jokes from their phones. Allison learned to recognize the subtle cues of conspiracy, the tension in a forced smile, the relief on Mark's face when Hannah texted that she'd arrived home safely. She created a master file not just of physical evidence, but of timelines, cross-reference stories, and suspicious coincidences. It was all painstakingly organized, an archive of deceit. When she wasn't investigating or documenting, Allison read up on trauma and infidelity recovery. Late at night, she scrolled through support forums and articles by therapists, identifying coping strategies and the stages of grief. Though she longed for someone to confide in, she chose silence. She didn't want pity. She wanted certainty, and certainty in the world of betrayal required discipline. Gradually, Allison reached out to experts where it felt safe. An accountant, a real estate agent, even a private investigator specializing in digital forensics. While she kept her inquiries hypothetical, she gathered information about options. How are assets generally divided? What is the process for proving infidelity if push came to shove? Could she remove Mark from joint accounts, if necessary? How do courts treat verbal abuse or patterns of gaslighting if it ever surfaced during negotiations? Each answer gave her more resolve and filled in the framework of her secret plan. All the while, Allison rehearsed her ending, mulling over the idea of the perfect reveal. She envisioned a moment when doubt would no longer be possible, when evidence would speak in her stead. Sometimes, she fantasized about confronting Mark and Hannah privately, forcing them to confront shame. Other nights, she imagined a more theatrical scene, a dinner party, a room full of witnesses, the unveiling of truth like the closing act of a play. And yet she kept reminding herself that this was not a revenge fantasy, but a necessity, a shield for her own self-worth, and a boundary drawn so that the lies would finally stop. Silent evidence gathering became Allison's anchor. She poured every ounce of pain, indignation, and love for what remained of herself into her secret project. With every day that passed, she grew less defined by victimhood and more by strategy. Allison was no longer simply waiting for the next betrayal to fall. She was constructing the foundation of her own justice, stone by stone, breath by breath. And as winter deepened outside, she steeled herself for the inevitable storm. The fateful anniversary. By December, the Harper household pulsed with a tightly contained anticipation, each member moving with the practiced choreography of a family long accustomed to hosting. But beneath the surface, Allison felt as though she stood alone on a dark stage, lit by a single spotlight, while the shadow of impending revelation loomed at the edges. Their wedding anniversary had always been a modest yet heartfelt occasion, quiet dinners at home, sometimes a weekend trip to the coast, a bottle of Pinot Noir uncorked by candlelight. But this year, Allison crafted an entirely different plan. She insisted that they throw a grand party, inviting not just family, but also colleagues from both her and Mark's offices, neighbors, and every friend who had ever called their house a second home. Mark seemed surprised by her sudden enthusiasm, but he didn't argue. Quite the opposite. He appeared relieved, perhaps grateful for Allison's burst of festive spirit after a season of stress and distance. He threw himself into the planning, suggesting caterers, approving the guest list, and even picking out a new navy suit for himself. Hannah, meanwhile, glided through the preparations with the familiar grace of a trusted friend, arranging flowers, sampling cake flavors, and promising to arrive early for setup. No one suspected that beneath Allison's warm smile and perfectly rehearsed laughter, a storm was gathering. In the weeks leading up to the party, Allison's days became a blur of lists and logistics. She ordered sprays of lilies and white roses for the foyer, brought out their best silver for polishing, and spent hours scrolling through photos for a slideshow she would present at the event. Every errand, every email thread served dual purposes: building the facade of a devoted wife and assembling the framework for her plan to publicly expose Mark and Hannah. The day of the anniversary arrived on the heels of a gentle snowstorm, blanketing the Connecticut neighborhood in winter's hush. By noon, the house was immaculate, hardwood floors gleaming, the kitchen fragrant with roasting garlic and rosemary, the marble-topped island laden with desserts from the town's finest bakery. Flutes of champagne lined the dining table, ready for toasts. Candles flickered in every room, transforming each corner into a tableau worthy of a magazine cover. Allison moved through the final hours of preparation with a collected precision that belied the roiling emotions beneath. She dressed in a soft silver gown, understated yet elegant, her hair swept into a chignon. Barely a tremor betrayed her racing heart as she added the finishing touches. A silk scarf, the pearl earrings Mark had given her on their 5th anniversary. She paused before the bathroom mirror, searching her own eyes for any sign of weakness. There was none. As the first guests arrived, laughter spilled out onto the porch, boots stamping off snow and cheeks flushed with cold. Mark greeted family and friends with practiced charm, his hand never leaving the small of Allison's back in a seemingly affectionate gesture. To outsiders, they looked every bit the adoring couple, the example neighbors pointed to with admiration. Hannah was radiant as ever, dressed in a sapphire blue dress that set off her auburn curls, bearing a bouquet of gardenias for Allison. The trio posed for photos, raised glasses in tribute, and shared inside jokes with their circle of friends. For a time, Allison allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of celebration. She chatted with her in-laws, offered hors d'oeuvres to Mark's boss, and toasted her childhood friend who had flown in from Boston. Between rounds of speeches, she darted upstairs to check her laptop, confirming that her digital folder, the carefully curated collection of emails, photos, and voice recordings, was ready and waiting, tethered to the living room projector by a secure connection. An hour into the party, the house was thrumming with conversation and music. Allison, sensing the moment approach, gathered everyone's attention with a gentle tap of her champagne flute. The crowd quieted, guests forming a semicircle around the projection screen in the living room. With practiced poise, Allison took the floor. Tonight, I wanted to honor not just our marriage, but the many people who have supported us, who have filled our home with laughter and love all these years, she began. Her voice was steady, warm, even affectionate. No trace of accusation colored her tone, just gratitude layered over an unspoken sorrow. Over the past few weeks, I've been reminded of the importance of honesty, loyalty, and the courage to face the truth, even when it hurts. So, before we raise a glass, I'd like to share a little journey I've been on. She clicked a button on the remote. Photographs flickered onto the screen. Cherished moments from years past. Family vacations, sunsets on the Jersey Shore, Hannah and Allison in matching hats one Halloween. The room smiled at the nostalgia, until, seamlessly, the tone shifted. A time-stamped dinner receipt, a snapshot of Mark and Hannah's cars parked side by side at a motel. A screen grab of flirtatious texts between aliases the guests recognized all too well. The atmosphere chilled almost imperceptibly. Allison could feel eyes darting, puzzled and then alarmed, as more images appeared. Security camera stills, muted but damning audio snippets of Mark and Hannah, whispering declarations too intimate to mistake. Every piece of evidence had been assembled with clinical thoroughness, presented without melodrama or editing. Mark stood frozen, his glass trembling ever so slightly in his hand. Hannah, white as the gardenias she had brought, stared at the floor. The rest of the guests were silent, the realization spreading in ripples, a private tragedy unfolding as public spectacle. Allison's voice wavered only once as she concluded. I share this not to hurt, but because truth must have a place in our lives, even when it asks us to change everything. Tonight, I reclaim my dignity and my future, and I thank those who truly love me for standing by my side. She stepped back, releasing the air she hadn't realized she was holding. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, friends and family rushed to her side, some expressing shock, others sorrow. A few offered awkward, useless apologies for never suspecting a thing. Mark tried to stammer out an explanation, but his words fell flat, scattered amid the remnants of laughter and trust. Hannah melted into the crowd, her figure shrinking with each step as those once close to her turned away. Through it all, Allison remained upright, shaken yet unbroken, the architect of her own deliverance. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the house emptied, Allison lingered in the living room, the embers of the last fire flickering in the hearth. Her hands trembled for the first time all night as she gathered the wedding photographs from the mantel, tracing each one with a strange tenderness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a hush of new beginnings. The fateful anniversary had redrawn the boundaries of her life. The masquerade was over. All that remained was a clean, hard truth, and the promise of a future finally, truly her own. The truth exposed. From the moment Allison finished her speech and returned to her place among the guests, the entire atmosphere of the Harper home was irrevocably altered. Gone was the warmth of celebration. The soft yellow glow of lamps now fell on faces frozen in shock, their smiles gone slack with disbelief. The familiar house seemed to constrict around its inhabitants, every corner echoing the magnitude of what had just been revealed. A suffocating silence pressed in, punctuated only by the faint hum of the projector and the heavy tick of the antique clock in the hallway. Allison's eyes, brimming with unshed tears yet fiercely resolved, swept the room. She took in her friends' and family's bewildered expressions, the way some clutched at their drinks in nervous distraction, while others put a steadying hand on their spouse's shoulder, as if to ensure their own reality remained intact. Mark was the first to move. He groped for the champagne flute he'd set on a side table, his movements wooden and mechanical. His face, usually composed and confident, was pale and waxen under the kitchen's overhead lights. Lines of worry engraved themselves into his forehead, visible even from across the room. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but all that emerged was a throaty rasp, a wordless, hopeless sound that signaled the start of his public unmasking. Hannah, for her part, seemed transfixed by the images still glowing on the screen. The evidence, each text, each time-stamped photograph, each muted voice recording, was irrefutable. Her hand flew instinctively to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Tears welled and spilled over, streaking her carefully applied makeup. Her shoulders curled inward, making her appear somehow diminished, her confidence collapsing under the weight of accusation and realization that the boundary between private dalliance and public shame had been shattered, perhaps forever. The guests, one by one, began to murmur. At first, the voices were soft, fragments of disbelief. Is this real? Did you know? How long has this been going on? Some people glanced at Mark with horror or dismay. Others looked away in embarrassment. Those closest to Allison, her mother, her childhood friend from Boston, her trusted neighbor Erica, immediately crossed the room to her side. Their embrace was gentle, wordless, but fiercely protective, a silent circle forming to shield her from the emotional fallout. Soon, the hush gave way to open confrontation. Mark's brother, red-faced and shaking, demanded explanations. "How could you? In your own house? With your wife's best friend?" He spat, his voice echoing off the walls. Mark, cornered and stripped bare, failed to produce any defense beyond halting denials, each more feeble and less believable than the last. The meticulousness of Allison's evidence had left no convenient spaces for excuses or revisionist histories. Whatever Mark might have said, the facts glared back at him with silent condemnation. Meanwhile, Hannah's phone buzzed repeatedly. Friends and co-workers texted in real time, drawn by live accounts from partygoers who couldn't resist the urge to share the scandal further. Outside, the December snowstorm had faded, but inside the Harper household, the emotional storm only grew. Even those who wished to feign ignorance or remain neutral found themselves swept up in the eruption. Several guests quietly slipped on coats and made their goodbyes, unable to witness more. In the kitchen, Allison's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, but her voice remained calm when she spoke. "This is not about vengeance. This is about truth," she said to the small cluster of those remaining, her words directed more to herself than any listener. "I refuse to carry someone else's secrets. What was done in the dark is now out in the open. We can start again, but we start from honesty." In the aftermath, those implicated reacted in turn. Hannah tried to approach Allison, stammering apologies through sobs. "I swear, I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. We got in too deep." Her words fell flat, dissipating into the thick air. Allison's response was level and unyielding. "You chose your secrets over my trust. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive you, but I know I can never be the friend you once had." Mark's attempt at private explanation was no more successful. "Allison, listen, it was complicated. I was stressed. Things with us." He ran a hand through his hair, searching for words, but Allison cut him off. "Don't put this on our marriage. Don't make me responsible for your choices." She spoke quietly, refusing to meet his pleading gaze. "You always thought you could control the narrative. Not anymore." As the reality set in, the guests' focus shifted. Waves of indignation and judgment rippled through the circles of acquaintances present. People Fred and Mark once called friends excused themselves early or stood at the periphery, their hushed conversations simmering with gossip. The social fabric of their world, woven from years of shared experiences and mutual trust, began to fray, its shreds trailing through the house long after the last guests departed. Word of the night's events spread far beyond the walls of the Harper home. By morning, whispers coursed through group texts and office Slack channels. Though nobody relished being at the center of a suburban scandal, the affair became the territory of others' outrage, their self-righteous indignation fueling the fire. Some neighbors were indignant, others were more quietly reflective, troubled by how easily deception can fester where love should grow. For Allison, the true pain set in not from the loss of marriage, but in the rupture of trust, the slow realization that her closest relationships will never be the same. Yet as daylight broke and she stood looking out over the snow-dusted yard, an unexpected relief settled in her chest. She had taken control of her own story, refusing to shrink from reality. The burden of pretending, the ceaseless reinscription of a happy facade, was at last cast off. In its place was something harder, but far more real. The unsparing honesty of wounds revealed to air, at last able to begin healing. Inside, the house looked as though a storm had passed through. Half-empty glasses, plates with cake untouched, pearls from Allison's earrings scattered on the floor near the staircase. She wandered through the rooms, pausing occasionally to close her eyes and steady her breathing. Each object, once innocent, seemed charged with the past. She gathered the pearls one by one, each one a small act of reclamation. Hannah slipped away before dawn, her figure silhouetted by the streetlights as she climbed into her car alone. Mark retreated to the den, door closing heavily behind him. In that pause, before the world woke again, Allison sat in the living room, wrapped in a quilt from her mother. The fireplace was cold, the only sounds the creaks of settling wood and her own quiet sniffles. And yet, beneath the ache, there was a budding sense of freedom, a knowledge that from this scorched earth, something else might grow. By the time the sun rose, Allison knew her life had changed irreparably. Old bonds had snapped, illusions had been sundered, and the world she knew was forever rearranged. Yet in the midst of pain and public exposure, she claimed something vital for herself. Truth spoken in her own voice, agency wrenched back from the hands of those who betrayed her. The cost was great, but the sense of possibility was real. The truth, at last exposed, was harsh, cold, and clarifying. But it was hers, unshared, unsoftened. And as Allison watched the sunlight warm the fresh snow, she felt the first flicker of what might one day become hope. The cold goodbye morning crept across the frozen Connecticut landscape as the Harper house stood silent under a layer of new snow. It wasn't just the aftermath of a party. There was a void in every room, a weight in the hallways where voices had lingered just hours before. Allison had slept little, caught in the strange limbo between exhaustion and adrenaline. She found herself awake before dawn, moving with quiet deliberation, the events of the previous night replaying on a relentless loop in her mind. The air in the house felt different now, denser, as if aware of the reckoning to come. Mark emerged from the den looking gaunt and unrested. Allison met his eyes in the kitchen, where a pot of untouched coffee sat cooling on the counter. Their conversation was almost businesslike, each word measured, each pause brimming with the reality that nothing between them could ever be the same. "Let's talk," Allison said, voice calm but unwavering. They sat at the kitchen table, a battered family heirloom suddenly serving as the front line of their dissolution. Mark tried to speak first, offering up apologies and fragile explanations, but Allison interrupted gently. "This is not the time for blame or rationalizing," she told him. "We're beyond that. This is about what comes next. What we owe to ourselves, not to argue anymore, but to be honest and fair as we end this." Mark's jaw tightened. His eyes darted from Allison to the window, where thin sunlight reflected off the snow. For a moment, it seemed he might plead for a second chance, but some instinct, perhaps pride or sheer fatigue, held him back. Allison opened her laptop with an efficiency born of sleepless nights. "You'll find I've already contacted a lawyer," she said, sliding a copy of the prenuptial agreement and recent bank statements across the table. "Connecticut's laws are straightforward. I've itemized the assets and proposed a division that's equitable. I intend for this to be as clean as possible. I've set up a separate account in my name. We can work out the logistics of the house, the cars, and everything else through our attorneys." He took the documents with trembling hands, the formality of it all underscoring how far they'd fallen from the world of shared secrets and spontaneous laughter. "There's nothing left here for us, Mark," Allison continued, her voice softer now but still resolute. "Not after this kind of betrayal. I hope you'll accept your share and start over. I need to do the same." He nodded, once, sharply, and looked down, his shoulders sinking under the weight of consequences. The conversation turned to the practical. When he would move out, what to tell the neighbors, how to handle mutual friends. It was the language of dismantling, spoken with awkward kindness and, in Mark's case, a palpable sense of defeat. By late morning, Allison was on the phone with her attorney, confirming the steps for filing for divorce. As advised, she sent a polite but clear message to Mark's employer, ensuring his personal circumstances would not impact her professional community ties. It felt surreal, this blend of heartbreak and legal proceduralism, but each task, however cold, brought her one step closer to reclaiming her life. The fallout in their social circle was immediate. News of the previous night's revelation had already begun to spread, and by lunchtime Allison's phone buzzed with a steady stream of texts and voicemails. Some friends wanted to offer support, while others, especially those closer to Mark or Hannah, were awkward, guarded, or just silent. A few reached out simply to confirm the rumors, their curiosity thinly cloaked as concern. Allison responded to only a handful of messages, making clear that she would not offer further details. "Thank you for your support," she wrote, "but I need time and space to move forward." As the afternoon waned, Allison watched through the bedroom window as Mark packed up his car with suitcases and boxes hastily filled with work shirts and books. He took one last look at the house they'd built together, then drove away, leaving only faint tire tracks in the slush. There was no dramatic goodbye, no embrace, or final argument, only the quiet, mutual knowledge that everything had changed. Hannah, meanwhile, had her own bitter reckoning. She texted Allison more than once, asking to meet or at least talk, her messages alternating between denial, regret, and desperate attempts at justification. Allison took her time in responding, and when she finally did, her words were clear. "We have nothing more to discuss. I hope you learn from this and find peace, but I am done." News of the affair, having already rippled outwards, had tangible consequences for both Mark and Hannah. Mark's absence at the office was as much a subject of speculation as the party scandal had been. Whispers followed him, deals dried up, and key clients pivoted to other account managers. His air of professional invincibility, carefully cultivated over years, crumbled rapidly in the fallout. Hannah faced a harsher exile. Her law firm, wary of attracting bad press or unsettling team dynamics, quietly reassigned her cases and then suggested she take an indefinite leave. Invitations to dinner parties vanished. Mutual friends turned cold or stopped returning her calls altogether. The woman who once moved so confidently through Allison's life now found herself shunned by the community she had helped cultivate. In the weeks that followed, Allison finalized paperwork with her lawyer, ensuring the division left her with a secure share of assets, the house, and, most importantly, her independence. She attended every appointment, every notary's counter and bank meeting, with the composure of someone who refused to be victimized any further. The work was grueling but necessary, a tangible shape to her new boundaries. At home, Allison changed the locks, sold Mark's remaining clothes, and cleared her life of the artifacts of their shared past. She donated their wedding china, boxed up faded photographs, and threw herself into small renovations, painting the kitchen a brighter color, rearranging furniture, planting winter bulbs in the front garden. Each act of erasure was also an act of creation, dissolving old energy so that something new might, in time, take its place. Yet not every pain, not every wound, could be so easily boxed up or painted over. Quiet evenings brought a deep ache, especially when the house settled and memory tried to fill in the silence. Allison let herself grieve in private, but only for a little while. She found solace not in bitterness or reliving every detail, but in planning what would come next. The cold goodbye was a gift she gave to herself. Not cruelty, but clarity. There would be no reenactment of the drama, no festering score to settle. The marriage ended with dignity, if not with grace, and Allison made peace with the fact that moving on was not just unavoidable, but necessary for her own survival. Late one night, a week after Mark's departure, Allison stood on the porch beneath a sky painted with sharp winter stars. She felt the wounds of the past throbbing quietly beneath her resolve, but also the pulse of possibility, thin but persistent, carrying her forward. As a crisp wind swept the last leaves from the old oak in the yard, Allison whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to Mark and Hannah, but to everything she had lost, and everything she hoped still to find. Fierce rebirth. Winter's dominance over the Connecticut landscape showed little sign of relenting, but inside the Harper home, something essential had begun to thaw. Alone now, Allison was confronted by the daunting vastness of the quiet. Mornings uncluttered by Mark's routines, evenings free from the anxious anticipation of what might be found on his phone or in the air between friends. The silence that once felt oppressive had started to fill with possibility. A blank canvas where fear had once laid every brushstroke. At first, Allison's days were marked by small but deliberate acts of self-preservation. She allowed herself to sleep in, savoring the comfort of her own bed, without the heaviness of companionship turned hostile. She played music as she cooked, letting jazz and classic rock and sometimes even pop invade the kitchen with their rhythms and hope. On weekends, Allison wandered local markets, her chest rising and falling with the easy pleasure of simple conversations with vendors and strangers. Each step became a reintroduction to herself, as if Allison were a friend she'd lost touch with and was now learning to know all over again. The most tangible change came in her work. No longer distracted by Mark's distance or the wound of betrayal, Allison poured her energy into her counseling at the middle school. Her patience deepened, her humor, once forced, now returned organically. She started piloting small group sessions for girls struggling with confidence or anxiety, guiding them with gentle wisdom. The smiles and whispered thank yous she received in return were a balm, a sign that life could flow meaningfully from even the most broken places. As the weeks passed and the divorce finalized, Allison made a bold choice. She would leave the house that had once been her pride and her prison. With a sense of resolve, she listed it with a realtor, packed her belongings, and began searching for a condo in a bustling neighboring city. The move was terrifying, exhilarating. She sold or donated most of her furniture, keeping only those things that truly sparked joy or memory. A battered armchair, her favorite books, a set of teacups inherited from her grandmother. It was a shedding of skin, the past left behind with each room she emptied. The new city was alive in ways Allison hadn't realized she craved. She found pleasure in anonymity, the freedom of not being Mrs. Mark Harper or even Allison from Connecticut, but a woman at a cafe, a volunteer at the library, a fresh face in a yoga class. Her loneliness sometimes crept in during slow evenings or in the flash of couples' laughter on the sidewalks, but these pangs were less sharp than expected. Independence, she learned, had its learning curve, but its rewards grew each day. In time, Allison rekindled old friendships and cultivated new ones. She tracked down Julia, her college roommate, and discovered a bond undimmed by years or distance. She joined a book club at her neighborhood bookstore, attending the first sessions with trembling nerves, then growing bolder as she was drawn into lively debates and laughter over shared stories. Slowly, trust in people and herself started to rebuild. She found herself exchanging numbers with a local teacher, then spending Saturday mornings hiking with him in the state park. Friendship and romantic possibility were approached with fierce caution, but not with outright refusal. Allison was determined. She would never again lose herself in another person's shadow. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of her renewal was Allison's decision to share her story. After a chance encounter at a community meeting, listening to a woman speak about surviving financial disaster, Allison realized the value in vulnerability. She volunteered with a nonprofit, supporting women navigating the aftermath of infidelity and divorce. In church basements and library meeting rooms, she spoke openly about deception, heartbreak, and the intricate, patient work of reclaiming one's own life. At first, her voice wavered, shame lingering on the edges of her honesty. But as the group sessions grew, so too did her confidence. Strangers approached to say her words had given them hope, a rare, irreplaceable gift. Allison's story never became bitter, nor did it turn to spectacle. She refused to dwell on the worst versions of Mark and Hannah, instead focusing on the strengths she discovered in herself: discipline, compassion, a new certainty that she could weather even the most wounding storms. She began writing too, first in her own battered journal, then essays published in community newsletters or counseling forums. Her words stitched together with grace, empathy, and hard-won wisdom. The past didn't disappear, but it began to serve as foundation rather than prison walls. Her relationship with her family also deepened. The initial shock and sadness of the divorce eventually gave way to open, heartfelt discussions about boundaries, trust, and resilience. Allison's mother visited her new condo frequently, sometimes staying over and painting late into the night, both of them savoring the peace and safety they'd constructed together. Her father, slow to process at first, eventually told her, "I wish you hadn't been hurt, but I'm proud of the woman you've become standing up from it." Insomnia still visited Allison from time to time, grief catching her off guard in the dark. But even in those moments, she was able to breathe through the ache and envision possibility. Travel to places she'd put off, new hobbies, pottery, painting, the occasional salsa class. She allowed joy to surprise her, whether in a rain-soaked afternoon at a museum or the impulsive pleasure of buying tickets to a jazz festival. The small adventures became their own kind of victory. By spring, the condo was fully hers. On nights, she hosted friends, serving homemade pies, debating politics and literature, joking about the disasters and delights of dating in her 40s. Allison recognized the profound shift in her life. She had moved through chaos and cold clarity to something rare. Her sense of self reborn, fierce, forgiving, and unsinkable. Standing late one evening on her tiny city balcony, Allison gazed at the frenetic lights below. Wind tangled her hair as she closed her eyes, a smile playing at her lips. There was emptiness, still, but it had changed shape. It was open now, full of promise. The woman she had become was nothing like the woman who had stayed silent for so long. And when doubt returned, as it sometimes did, there was comfort in knowing she would meet it not as a wife betrayed, but as a survivor, a mentor, and a woman newly whole. Her fierce rebirth was not an erasure of pain, but a testament to her own power. The scars proved she had healed, and stronger than ever, Allison was ready to embrace whatever life next chose to offer. Confronting the past. Spring tiptoed quietly into the city, its soft breezes and persistent sunlight coaxing blooms from trees and cracks in the pavement. Allison, settled now in her new life, had begun to believe that the worst was behind her, that with each sunrise she was farther from the wounds of betrayal and closer to a future carved on her own terms. Yet the past, she realized, did not simply dissolve with a new address or new routines. Its echoes still found their way into her quietest nights and most unguarded moments. It started with an email. Its subject line, heartbreakingly simple. Can we talk? Mark's address stared back at her from her phone, catching her on a rare day off. For a long time, she left it unread, her thumb hovering just above the screen. The anxiety she felt wasn't just about what he might want, but whether she was ready to hear it. 2 days later, another message arrived, this time from Hannah. Please, Allison, I know I am the last person you want to hear from. I am so sorry. I'd give anything for a chance to explain. Allison let the emails pile up. For months, she'd practiced the discipline of looking forward, not back. Yet these messages tugged at her, not because she missed either of them, but because a part of her still hungered for clarity, for the finality only a direct confrontation could provide. After a week of restless sleep, Allison replied, arranging to meet Mark in a neutral public place, a quiet coffee shop off a busy street where conversation would be honest, but the safety of strangers would offer her an anchor. She chose a table by the window, sunlight streaming onto the small glass vase holding a single daffodil. Mark arrived early, looking smaller than she remembered, his once polished presence dulled by palpable regret. He sat opposite her, hands wrapped around a mug of tea he barely touched. For a while, neither spoke beyond pleasantries. Then, his voice broke the silence. I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, Mark said, his eyes fixed on a spot between them. But I want you to know how sorry I am, for all of it. I've replayed everything 1,000 times. You didn't deserve what I did. If there's any way I could... His voice trailed off, hope and shame warring in his features. Allison listened, surprise blooming not at his remorse, but at her own calm. Where once anger or heartbreak would have gripped her, there was only a distant sorrow and a profound acceptance. Mark, she said softly, I spent so long wondering what I did wrong, but I've realized your choices had nothing to do with my worth. She paused, meeting his gaze steadily for the first time. I don't hate you. I can even hope you learn from this. But forgiveness is something I give myself, by letting go. I wish you well, and I need to live my life now, without carrying any more of yours. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, nodding, the weight of her words settling between them. The conversation shifted, awkward at first, then slowly more honest. They spoke of what had gone wrong, danced around lost dreams and the lies whispered in the dark. There was pain, inevitable and shared, and a strange sense of liberation, the relief of not having to hide or defend anything anymore. Afterward, leaving the cafe felt like stepping out of a heavy coat she'd worn through too many winters. For the first time in months, Allison felt her shoulders lighten. The confrontation hadn't changed the past, but it had loosened the knots she'd been carrying inside her. It was another 2 weeks before Allison agreed to meet Hannah. They chose a city park, its pathways lined with bursts of tulips and the laughter of children playing nearby. Allison wore a simple dress, her hair loose, feeling strong in her vulnerability and certain of her boundaries. Hannah appeared, her face haunted, her voice trembling with unshed tears. I've thought about what I'd say 100 times, she started. None of it makes up for what I've done, I know. You were my closest friend. I'd give anything to take back the hurt I caused you, to fix what we broke. I can't ask you to ever trust me again, but I hope you can forgive me. Someday. For your own peace, if not for mine. Allison listened, feeling the tension and hurt pressing at her chest. For years, their friendship had been the closest thing to a sisterhood she'd known. The sense of loss almost equaled the betrayal, but time, distance, and self-work had dulled the blade. "I used to wish you'd never entered my life," Allison admitted quietly. "But we had good years too. I'll remember them, but I can't be that friend for you anymore. My peace doesn't depend on erasing what happened, just on letting it stop controlling my heart." Tears ran down Hannah's cheeks, and for a moment they sat in silence. Two women forever changed. Their goodbye was subtle, a nod, a thread of shared memory passing between them. Then Allison stood, walking away with measured steps. She felt the sun warm her skin, the world shifting ever so slightly toward hope. That week, Allison gave herself a gift. She combed through her old journals, reading the words she had written in her loneliest days, pages laced with grief and uncertainty. Instead of shame, she found pride. It was evidence of her survival, each entry a rung in the ladder she'd climbed to this very place. She spent an afternoon on her balcony, burning a handful of those pages in a small clay dish, the smoke curling into the blue spring sky. With each wisp, another piece of heartache drifted away. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting. Each confrontation, with Mark, with Hannah, and most importantly, with herself, became a testimony to the woman she was and the woman she was becoming. She no longer measured her worth against her marriage, her friendships, or the opinions of a hushed, judgmental community. Allison began taking new risks, small at first, then braver. She signed up for a pottery class, her hands caked in fragrant, yielding clay. She laughed more easily, fell into spontaneous dances in her kitchen, and traveled to places she had never seen alone, her world growing wider with every brave step. She spoke to support groups and, on a whim, submitted an essay about her journey to a national women's magazine, receiving a heartfelt letter from an editor who saw in her story the glimmer of inspiration others might need. As the season deepened, Allison's new life felt rooted in forgiveness, not just of others, but of herself. She no longer wondered what she could have done differently. She let herself believe in happiness again, not as a promise from someone else, but as a gift she could shape with her own hands. One evening, while hosting friends in her sunlit condo, Allison raised a toast, not to survival, but to courage, authenticity, and the adventure of futures untold. She smiled, feeling whole in a way she had never known before. The past no longer held her hostage. She had faced it, spoken her truth, and at last set herself free.